Hello, everyone.
Morning.
Morning. Sorry.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I think that means that everybody's been let in from the waiting room. Fingers crossed, you can all hear me. Elizabeth, if you want to make the screen back to the spotlight, I can't. Brilliant. Okay. I think that means that everybody's there and we're all here. Welcome on this rather grey and wet day in Sheffield to the latest in the CRESR Seminar series, which is focusing on the impact of COVID on low-income families. It's great to have both Ruth Patrick from York University talking about her research on the lived experience of low-income families through COVID and her COVID Realities project. She will speak first for 15 minutes, and then Tony Wilson from the Institute for Employment Studies will talk about work from his perspective on looking at the labour market and employment policy across the impacts of COVID on families. Tony's held up in a meeting at the moment, so hopefully he will be with us in 15 minutes time to share his slides. Obviously, he's absolutely immersed in all things in and around employment policy, labour markets and skills and disadvantaged groups over time, both at the Institute of Employment Studies, but also previously at DWP, the Work and Learning Institute, and other places. So without further ado, because we're quite tight for time, I'll hand over to Ruth. She'll share her screen and then she'll go through her presentation, and then we'll go to Tony. The plan is that you can add any questions at any point into the chat function. Peter Wells is going to be moderating the questions at the end of the session. So what will happen is if you put in questions and then you say, you know, who it's directed to, who you are, then Peter will moderate at the end, bringing all the questions together. So it will be done through the chat function rather than us having lots of screens everywhere trying to work out where everybody is. So thanks, Ruth, that's great. And without further ado, I'll hand over to you. If you want, I'll give you a shout sort of about 2 minutes before the end, just to keep things going to time. Okay, thanks, Ruth.
Yeah, thank you, and thanks everyone for being here. I'm going to try really hard to keep to time, but I'm also going to start with an apology. So I was emailing the organisers like late last night because I had my COVID vaccine yesterday, which is amazing. It's like really good news and I'm really pleased, but it does mean I'm feeling like slightly below par. So all like errors and mistakes and poorness in my delivery of this presentation we excuse the COVID vaccine, which is obviously really good news, and I'm really thankful for having it. So what I wanted to do today is just talk as briefly as I can about kind of the research I've been doing through the COVID Realities project, which is looking at kind of documenting and exploring everyday life for families living on a low income. And just to say that this is collaborative work with a kind of team of colleagues. It's participatory as well, so it's working directly with parents and carers who are themselves living on a low income. And actually the opening slide is an illustration by one of those parents and carers, by Emma, who was reflecting on and thinking about the decision about the £20 uplift to universal credit, and this was her kind of illustration of that. But it's also a kind of collaborative effort with partners at the University of York and at Birmingham as well. Okay, so it's hard, like, I don't know, well, I don't know if it's hard. It's quite hard to cast our kind of mind back to last March, and that was kind of the point at which we started thinking about doing this piece of research. And I suppose the kind of question we were asking ourselves or thinking about is, why does it feel important, you know, to document and try and understand life on a low income during the pandemic? And I think for us in kind of developing the proposal, it was just very clear that there was a kind of a return of that kind of all in it together rhetoric. I've sort of said this was like version 2, so going back to the austerity period, that rhetoric had returned with the arrival of the pandemic, and talking about us all kind of going through into the pandemic together and having to face similar challenges. And it was clear, and as it has come increasingly clear with kind of subsequent evidence, that it would not be equal experience, and that inequalities would be both kind of very evident in people's experience of the pandemic, but also potentially exemplified and amplified through the pandemic. But also, and in terms of kind of motivating factors behind the research, there was a feeling of the importance of working together and bringing in a kind of wider range of voices into discussions about post-COVID futures. And I think we're still not very good at that. So when we look at the debates and the discussions in the media and within the kind of political arena about what needs to change, it's still quite a small type of kind of elite voices that are having those discussions. And part of the project is about actually trying to, you know, push for change there, and to say that actually, and this again is a further motivation of the project, we do need to work with and draw on the expertise that comes with experience. So if we're looking at how do we build a post-COVID future that is less unequal, let's look at ideas and suggestions from those who have direct kind of experience of the impact of that inequality. So I have to go through this slide really quickly because of time. And I think I could actually do the whole presentation on this slide, but I'm not going to because I won't have any time for anything else. But I think that when we reflect on and explore the kind of social security response to the pandemic, both in terms of the policy changes, but also in terms of the narratives that we've heard produced and reproduced, what we see and what we're kind of seeing is the endurance of kind of some very old kind of rhetoric and narratives that we've seen for many years. And actually, I wrote an article on this with Aaron Reeves, and it was kind of focusing on the kind of post-2010 period, and we got some critique, which was very fair critique, saying of course this goes back much further. So, you know, we acknowledge the kind of very long history of kind of looking at kind of social welfare in kind of very negative, problematic ways, but also on these kind of divisions being drawn and redrawn between deserving and undeserving populations. And I think, and I'm sure Tony will get into this in more detail, that things like the pause of conditionality, which was obviously positive, but then its return, ultimately, they do show the kind of deep rootedness of these ideas around, for example, the agency of social welfare claimants being like inherently deficient and needing that kind of corrective action, even in the context of a pandemic, where the kind of, you know, efforts, and indeed participants in the project talk to us about this, the efforts to kind of seek and secure work can feel really quite futile. But also, and I think we saw this in some of even Boris Johnson's statements about universal credit in advance of the decision about the £20 uplift, we have really simplistic and flawed kind of assessments around the relationships between paid work and welfare, and particularly around, you know, how universal credit functions within that. So, you know, we heard Boris Johnson talking about the government having to make a decision about whether to support people on welfare or to support people in work, completely neglecting, of course, the reality that many of people in work are also reliant on the social security system. So yes, so I can pick this up more in questions, but I'm going to move on. But I think that's a really important kind of groundwork, you know, for when we look at and understand what's going on kind of post, you know, during the pandemic. But what are we doing through the research? So the COVID Realities Research programme was funded by the Nuffield Foundation as part of their kind of rapid response to COVID and their kind of funding call. And I guess, and what I'm going to talk about today is what is kind of maybe in some ways a kind of core, or the core component of that research programme, which is participatory online research with over 100 parents and carers who are living on a low income and across the UK. So we have kind of participants working with us from all 4 regions of the UK. And participants can take part in a range of ways. So they complete online diaries, they respond to what we describe as big questions of the week, which are sort of short video questions, but they also take part in virtual discussion groups. And importantly, the fieldwork has been going on since last June, so since June 2020, and will continue to July 2021, giving us a whole year of mapping and exploring and documenting life during the pandemic. The research is underpinned by an ethics of kind of care and reciprocity. And again, I can pick this up in questions if people are interested, but the methodological decisions are really rooted in that. So, you know, I kind of lead the project, but I spend an awful lot of my time thinking about the real practicalities about, are we making sure that the participants are properly supported and feel properly thanked for the really important work that they're doing with us. But the COVID realities work spans and extends beyond that. And importantly, we also have a programme of kind of research synthesis that maps across 15 projects and is led by Kaylee Garthwaite, that's looking at research that was already ongoing previous to the pandemic, that we could see as the pandemic continued would tell us something important about kind of the intersect of kind of COVID and poverty and the social security response. And so Kaylee is working you know, with those research teams to bring together and synthesize the findings. We've also been working with project partner Child Poverty Action Group to track the social security response through their early warning system, which is a database of contact with welfare rights advisors, and which gives us really kind of invaluable expertise from the kind of welfare rights kind of perspective as well. We also, and I guess these seminars in a way, or this seminar today is part of that, we also have kind of helped create a sort of holding space for researchers to think through how to kind of work ethically and sensitively kind of in a new and fast changing context, you know, that the pandemic represents. And that has included a very successful and popular webinar series and also a blog series. And again, that's primarily led by Kaylee. Finally, we've got some economic modelling that's been done by Tom Lee at CPAG that's looking at policy changes and their likely impact on poverty, but also is very closely aligned to and kind of comes out of often the findings from the participatory work. So it allows us to bring those things into conversation. Right, I can see the clock ticking, so I'm going to move on. So what I wanted to do now is just to share some kind of empirical evidence from our work with parents and carers. And obviously, because of time, I have to be brief, but I wanted just to showcase some things about everyday realities for families and then look at the social security response. And I'm going to talk really fast to try and do it justice. But I just pulled out, you know, one example for each kind of theme. And then there's also sometimes links to further reading on these areas. I think a key thing that we found in our research is the extent to which, and this is probably not surprising to most of you here, the extent to which the parents and carers we're working with experienced rising costs in the context of the pandemic. And that was often quite different from what they were hearing in terms of the national conversation, where people were talking about being able to save more, not spending because people weren't going to get a nice coffee in a coffee shop or commuting to work. But the parents we were talking about, as this quote shows here, talked about things like their food bills rising and rising heating, utility costs because of the kind of conditions that the pandemic created. We also had, and this is probably one of like the core, you know, kind of findings so far, was around the experience of intersecting and insecurities. So for us, this is the idea that across the pandemic, we all face everyday insecurity. So we all face, you know, those of us with children, we face a kind of question about, will they be able to go to school? Will their bubble burst? But for families that are also living with financial insecurity, they face a further layer of insecurity that intersects with and compounds the kind of insecurity of the pandemic. And that can then create a very difficult context to be living through. And so Dottie G, who lives in Scotland, kind of describes this, where she talks about schools going back and, you know, having to manage the insecurity of her daughter actually about schools going back. But also, she also had a mad rush on trying to find a way to afford a school uniform for my daughter. And this is a theme that kind of returns again and again. So the kind of the climate of insecurity, as I say, that we all face being compounded and made more difficult because of people's financial insecurity. We also had, and this has been like really well documented in the evidence base, lots of examples of people talking about having to turn to kind of food banks and emergency forms of provision for support, but significantly, and this is perhaps less documented, and again we can maybe come to in questions, the issue of the inadequacy sometimes of that charitable provision. So this long quote that you can read, I can't read out because of time, is around someone saying, you know, they received a food parcel that had inedible, it had stale bread in it. And the experience of that in terms of kind of stigma and shame around poverty just being kind of really, you know, made so much worse to feel like, you know, she says, you know, I know beggars can't be choosers, but 4 loaves of inedible bread was an emotional blow at the time. So just issues around having to rely on charitable provision. And then, and this is probably not surprising, but it's a really core theme that one of our colleagues, Katie Pybus, is doing some more work on at the moment, is around the negative mental impact, health impact. And this was both on parents, but also on their children. And so Danny talks about, you know, she couldn't afford the Eat Out to Help Out, so we never managed to do anything before the Rule of Six came into play. And she says, you know, the isolation is really debilitating and the loneliness is crippling at times. And we saw kind of negative mental health impacts in terms of that loneliness and isolation, but also connected with living through the kind of financial insecurity and having to manage the everyday hardship that parents were experiencing. Before I spend like 1 minute or something on the social security response, I think this is like a really key point as well that we want to pull out, which is around people feeling excluded from the national narrative and from the national conversation about coronavirus and about how we as a kind of nation move forward and move away from the narrative. And so Rosie here, and this is a really recent diary entry, talks about how she's fed up of seeing people on social media telling me their plans for when lockdown is over, booking holidays and festivals. I can't afford that. When lockdown is lifted, we will still have to stay at home because financially we won't be able to afford to go anywhere else. And I think we all, and certainly politicians, we have a duty when we're talking about those post-COVID futures to recognise that, you know, for many people, the kind of the poverty and hardship means that a lot of what's being discussed and looked forward to is simply out of reach for people. And obviously that's a political choice linked to our social security system. Okay, so really quickly, so the experiences of social security through the pandemic, they're obviously completely intertwined with everyday life that I've just been talking about. The temporary measures, which are obviously have just been made more temporary with the budget decision, were experiences helpful for those who received them, but they weren't enough. And I think we have to be careful when we talk about the £20 uplift, for example, as being a lifeline or as being really important, to recognise that although it's a significant increase in social security provision, it doesn't solve the problem. People are still experiencing very real, you know, financial hardship. So Lexi here, you know, she's getting that additional help, and she says no one in today's day and age should be choosing between eating and heating. So it hasn't solved those kind of fundamental problems and challenges. You know, and this is very much interlinked to this point. What we have seen, and this is like a massive issue and a kind of criticism of the social security response, is we have seen a complete absence of targeted support for families with children. So we know, and everyone we work with through COVID Realities has dependent children. We know that they've faced increased kind of financial pressures around having the children at home more of the time. And, you know, as Jasmine says, you know, try and have internet so her child can homeschool. And we haven't had a targeted provision of support for those families. And that's been a real kind of absence, I think, in the government's response. We'll just skip through this, but, you know, debt deduction's been a real issue. And then, you know, the kind of that links to kind of design issues with universal credit, but the fact that people are having debt deductions taken from their benefits that are then pushing people further and deeper into poverty. And, you know, Aurora there talks about saying, you know, simply not being able to afford her rent this month and destitution was never the plan. And, you know, those debt deductions were paused, but only temporarily, and are now back in force. Okay, so I think I'm at 15 minutes, but Tina's very nice. It's nice to have a kind of relaxed chair, but just a couple of quick final things. So I think, you know,
finish up, that's great.
Oh yeah, okay, I'm kind of getting there. In terms of kind of contact with advisors, I think that, you know, we all know this, and I'm sure most of you that are on this kind of Zoom know this as well, that there's massive power differentials between particularly because of conditionality between claimants and advisors. And what we saw sometimes was a lack of sensitivity to the new context, and maybe sort of letters that went out that didn't kind of acknowledge the new context that claimants were living in and experiencing, and then put again the additional strain on claimants. So this example is from Charlotte, who has a telephone interview scheduled for a medical professional, and she got the letter that said it specifically stated there was to be limited background noise. And I won't kind of, you know, read the quote, you guys can read it on the screen, but what's important is that letter, obviously, I'm sure it wasn't meant in a kind of, you know, as it was received, but she became very concerned and anxious about her son making noises on that call and the impact that might have potentially on her benefit eligibility. And then in the end, the appointment was rescheduled. So she experienced a very difficult period of worry that, you know, that was not necessary. And I suppose there's maybe a plea there for those kind of letters to have more understanding, as I suppose many of us are asking our employers to as well, of the realities of those kind of juggling that people are doing in terms of maybe having children at home at times when they wouldn't normally happen. Return of conditionality. So Tony, I'm sure, is going to cover this in like loads more detail, but definitely participants feeling quite despondent or really despondent about the return of conditionality. And, as Victoria B says here, who is a survivor of domestic violence, she says, now I have to be the obedient pup again and jump through the hoops, apply for jobs who won't take me. And, she does all this just so I can say I tried, but no interviews yet. And so I think then that sense of the sort of futility rooted in and linked to the conditionality system has been quite a key experience for participants. And then depressingly, but not surprisingly, just that persisting experience of kind of benefit and poverty stigma. So a sense that actually, although there's quite a lot of talk about attitudes to social security and perhaps to poverty as well, shifting because of the context of the pandemic, people still reflecting and talking about their own experience of kind of stigma tied to the benefit system. So we have Teddy here talking about applying for a discretionary grant and having to try and justify why she needed it and saying, this is humiliating and degrading. It makes you feel like you have to justify your experience and existence to a stranger. Okay, so I went slightly over just to conclude with some really super brief reflections. Obviously, and it's obvious I would say this, the social, and as Alison Garnham has said as well, and lots of others, the social security system went into the pandemic, ill-equipped to offer effective security for families. So that was like our starting point, and everything we've seen since, is kind of rooted in that starting point. I think, and I could say loads more about it, that the government has really kind of worked with and continued kind of existing narratives of welfare, and has also in their kind of policy failed to protect families from often extreme hardship. And, we've heard, and it's right to kind of praise, the DWP in terms of responding, universal credit system responding quite effectively in terms of the massive increase in numbers, but there are still really endemic issues of design and issues of adequacy that do remain unaddressed and that we need to kind of keep calling for action on. Much more needs to be done to address the issue and design out the issue of stigma in our social security system. And then finally, like building back better, and talk of a kind of post-COVID future does need to be much bolder on social security, and also needs to work much more closely with and recognise a kind of broader range of expertise on social security. That's it. Thank you. Sorry to go on a bit.
Not at all, Ruth. That was absolutely excellent. I think I can see people clapping on the screens that I can see. And yes, great. I thought it was brilliant. I think it really brings to life those issues in and around a really divided experience of what's going on in the post-COVID world in terms of which end of the income spectrum you might be at. I'd like to welcome now Tony Wilson, who I hope is out there somewhere. And if he
hello.
Hi Tony. I gave an introduction to you at the beginning, so which you probably missed, but welcome to the seminar, and it'd be great if you could share your screen and give us 15 minutes in and around your exploration of the impact of COVID on low-income families and low-income households from an employment perspective.
Yeah, will do. Thanks, Tina, and thanks, Ruth. I was sorry to join a couple of minutes late. I joined just when Ruth started talking. So I very much agree with the points that Ruth was making around particularly how these impacts have been felt by people in low incomes and within the social security system. And I will talk a bit about conditionality perhaps at the end, just on some concluding comments on some of the issues and risks around the return to conditionality. I'm going to talk about the broader labour market impacts and the policy response, and where I see as the key priorities, some of the things that are missing so far, and what I think we need to be prioritising and focusing on next. So taking a bit of a sort of quantitative view, I suppose, around some of how the labour market impacts have been felt so far for different groups, and the implications of that. I mean, the first point I'd make is so I just clearing my screen. There's a few things are popping up there. The first point I make is, this isn't going to be a V-shaped recovery. This is the OBR's forecasts of what growth, of what output would have been, the green line, and what it has been, the black line, and then successive forecasts, the most recent one being that yellow one. So, clearly, although it feels like I think we are now, one would hope, coming out of the public health crisis, the economic crisis and the labour market crisis, and the social crisis, I think, is we're still in the foothills of that, and we're still facing a significant road back to getting back towards where we were before. And I think many of us don't want to be back just to where we were before. We need to be addressing some of the long-standing inequalities and challenges we faced in the labour market and society. Now, why isn't my screen moving on? However, the first point to make, I think, is, and I think we do need to recognise this point, things could have been, certainly in labour market terms, unemployment terms, far, far worse. I mean, a year ago, just over a year ago, this was the July forecast, we were anticipating and fearing unemployment of 4 or even 5 million. And as the early data started to come through around impacts on new claims to universal credit in particular, it really felt like that was that was happening, that was going to manifest itself. By November, the forecasts had been revised down to unemployment of 7.5% peaking, which would have been would have been huge. I mean, that would have been getting on for 3 million, about 2.5 to 3 million. The most recent forecast, however, we're now seeing unemployment now being forecast as peaking even lower, about 6.5%, which will be equivalent to roughly 2.2 million people. And why is that? I mean, we know the reasons for this, but largely this reflects the impacts of the job retention scheme in protecting jobs. It wasn't perfect. In particular, there's too much too much reliance on employers in doing the right thing and in furloughing staff, and we know that many people slip through the cracks, particularly people in less secure work. But really, at peak, over 10 million workers, 1/3 of all of those who are in work, which is a phenomenally eye-wateringly large figure, were either off work or working reduced hours. And here we've presented those things separately. So the blue is people away from work, and the yellow is people working fewer hours. I mean, it's important to know, even in the full lockdown, about half of the labour market adjustment amongst workers was happening in lower hours, not in full furlough. And so not all of that happened in the furlough scheme either. This is real impacts on people's incomes, particularly often people in less secure and lower paid work, people in self-employment, adjusting with, by working fewer hours, taking fewer shifts, being offered fewer shifts, and so on. I mean, interestingly, by the time we get through to kind of late October, this is where the kind of trough was here around kind of Q4, week 3, Q4, week 4. The excess number of people who had reduced hours or away from work had dropped by about 3/4, rose again with the second lockdown, fell back again, and then rose again through to the end of the year. But huge adjustment. And we can't underestimate what a massive crisis this has been. 10%, even now, 2020 we've seen a 10% fall in GDP, the largest fall on record. Massive fall in employment, and we really can't understate this is a huge labour market shock. 800,000 fewer people in payrolled employment at the peak. That's recovered slightly now. It's about 725,000, I think. But had the fall in employment mirrored the fall in GDP, employment would have fallen by something like 3 million people. And we entered the crisis with unemployment of 1.4 million. It could have been catastrophically bad. We're in a slightly odd position now that will almost certainly have the lowest post-recession peak in unemployment since the kind of oil crises and stagflation in the 70s. And this is despite having the largest GDP fall. Just a brief note on what's happening sort of right now. I mean, payroll employment is growing now, it seems. This is sectors, you won't be able to see this particularly well, I don't think, along the bottom. Employment is still really suffering. This is PAYE, it's administrative data. Still really suffering, obviously, in kind of shutdown sectors in particular, accommodation and food services. Retail's a little bit different, but accommodation, food services, arts and entertainment, etc. Manufacturing, that's largely food manufacturing, actually, rather than making stuff. Well, it is making stuff, it's making food, isn't it? But food manufacturing is in particular has been hit. It's been hit very hard as people stay at home, don't travel to work, etc. But at the other end, actually, quite strong employment growth in administrative and support services, which I think is mainly related to test and trace. And health and social work, which is also related to pandemic response. These jobs are often, likely to be, related to the pandemic. The question mark about how sustained that will be. But labour market has shown signs of recovery in recent months. That's positive. I'll skip that. Now, the government, I think, do deserve credit for the job retention scheme. They deserve credit for the £20 universal credit uplift. They also, they responded quicker and more comprehensively and with more stuff than we did in the 2008-2009 recession when I was working in government. This is a selection of the things that government announced literally during the first 3 months of the crisis, multiple billions of pounds. And within that, doubling of work coach capacity capability, doubling work coach capacity. So employment advisors able, to provide back to work support for people who are out of work. Significant investment in employment services in particular. So mainly, it's been an employment services plan for jobs in the summer with the Restart programme, £3 billion programme for back to work support for long-term unemployed people. Expansion of increased investment in apprenticeships. The announcement of Kickstart. We'll talk at length about any of these. Very happy to in questions. Observation though, this is a lot of this is welcome, but I think big question marks about how you then make sense of this, how this stacks up for individuals, how this stacks up for employers, particularly employers who want to do the right thing and want to be creating opportunities and supporting disadvantaged groups in recovery, and how it stacks up locally, for those organisations trying to deliver services, and also within local communities and for local partners. It's worth saying too, I think, we were really disappointed with the budget last week and the lack of measures around employment, and that's mainly what I'll focus on now. The things that are missing and things aren't doing enough on. I think ultimately this is, the recovery is going to be a marathon rather than a sprint. And we had an enormous amount of activity on the labour market, and I'm responding to what looked like fast rising unemployment last summer. I do fear that the government might consider this to be job done when we look at the most recent OBR forecasts. There's a real paucity of measures and a real reliance on there being a strong private sector led recovery. So 6 areas which I'll cover in 8 minutes and then stop. First priority, we really do need to get hiring going again, and this is going to be the most significant challenge, and this most important thing we can do to, I think, support those in low income zones who've lost work is to be creating new and better jobs to support a strong recovery in the labour market. I won't dwell on this, it's not really the focus of the session or discussion today, but it's not enough for hiring to get back to where it was before the crisis. We need to be well above where we were, and we're too reliant, I think, at the moment on a strong private sector led recovery, and that didn't happen last summer because of huge spare capacity and uncertainty, and I think we're facing similar risks now. This illustrates a point. So the blue bar here is the monthly flow into new employment, payroll employment, PAYE data, and the yellow bar is the flow out of employment, employee employment. So you can see the crisis there when the blue falls and the yellow rises, but then actually job losses fallen down to pre-crisis levels almost, pretty quickly after that, and are broadly running at the levels they were before the crisis. Hiring has taken a long time to recover, which is not a surprise, but we've got all of that space, all of that gap to make up and more if we want to address inequalities. We really, really need to be focusing on how we create more and better jobs, and not just how we try to protect jobs that already exist. And that furlough will be the answer to our labour market challenges. It clearly isn't. I think we also had a real missed opportunity in the budget to support job creation. A really good way to support hiring in the short term would have been short-term job creation. We have a crisis in social care and repeated broken promises and how we'd address that. And we've got a massive challenge in getting to net zero. And the Climate Change Committee have written really effectively on this over the summer around the range of things we need to do, but also the case for investing now during the crisis, because the economic benefits of that are far greater, and the potential, employment impacts of investing in our charging infrastructure for electric vehicles and energy efficiency in buildings, in any number of areas. And clearly, I think we do need significant investment in local services, which are not just at risk of standing still, but going backwards as income falls from rates and from local services. Significant shortfalls in local government funding, which we need to address, but then also with real opportunities to create local. To create jobs to support local communities and local growth. And not only was this missing, but the budget penciled in pretty significant cuts to public spending, as has become clear, as many of you will know, in the aftermath of the budget, as the details started to become clearer, that 13, 14, 15 billion pounds reductions in unprotected budgets in subsequent years in public spending. This will start to feel like quite a significant fiscal tightening later in this Parliament if the government doesn't address this. Now, more importantly, I think for today, I do think there are a couple of areas I'm really concerned about around rising long-term unemployment and around support for disadvantaged groups and addressing labour market inequalities. On long-term unemployment, this is going to likely double. I'll use here a definition of long-term unemployment, which includes young people who've been unemployed for more than 6 months, but then other age groups unemployed for more than 12 months. Now, the forecast rise in unemployment, overall unemployment here is shown in blue. In yellow, I've just done an illustration of what that might mean for long-term unemployment, given the lags that we know. This is going to peak. This isn't going to peak this year. It's probably not going to peak next year. It will likely peak in late 2022, early 2023. And we could be talking about up to 1 million people who are long-term unemployed. That is a significant challenge, and it is rising already. This shows rising long-term unemployment by age right now. Youth long-term unemployment, 6-month plus unemployment, has increased by 1/3 in the last year, and it's rising quite hard already for people aged 25 and over as well. And last crisis, it took 5 years for long-term youth unemployment to peak. And we just cannot afford to make these mistakes again, and to write off another generation of predominantly disadvantaged young people who become long-term unemployed. And it was public policy, actually, I think, to a large extent, that let young people down last time. It wasn't the economic recovery. It was the withdrawal of support in 2011 as we started to get a lid on rising long-term youth unemployment, and then the tightening of public spending in the sort of 2011-2013 period. So Restart, I think, will be welcome, and I'm happy to talk about this. I mean, it is a welfare to work programme, and I think that brings with it risks, in particular because, as Ruth said, there's a risk that we revert to a highly conditional sort of sanctions-led model in future. I think that's a really significant risk, and it's one we've warned about with officials privately and talked about publicly too. But I think there is significantly more investment in this per person than there has been in any number of previous programmes. And there's a number of measures in place to try to keep spending within the programme to reduce excess profits and support reinvestment in services and support better partnership working. But it's going to take a long time to get going, and Restart is not really going to be in place until spring 2022 when you dive into the detail. And I think 1 year is a long time to wait at the best of times, particularly a long time for young people. Many people by early 2022 have been waiting 2 years for support. We do need a meaningful jobs and training guarantee. I think ideally at all ages, but certainly for young people. Needs to be an early priority. On tackling disadvantage, there's a few areas I point to. First is around age. 3/5 of the fall in employment has been amongst young people, despite only accounting for about 1/9 of the labour market. And actually, importantly, young people are not obviously benefiting from the recent recovery. Yellow shows the growth in employment in the last 3 months. Blue shows the fall in employment in the previous 8 months. Young people who've been hit hard by employment falls have not benefited particularly from the recovery either. On gender, we've seen actually similar employment impacts for men and for women, which is possibly driven as much by the jobs that are being created as the jobs that have been lost. I think women have clearly been significantly affected through lockdown, through school closures, and also because of the occupational impacts. The rate of crisis has fallen on retail and hospitality and on childcare. Childcare has actually stood out as an area which lost a lot of jobs in the first wave, as it were. But we found really significant. We did a big piece for the ILO looking at wage impacts, and the UK stood out as having one of the largest differences in wage bill losses between men and women. So wage bill kind of takes account of earnings loss as well as employment loss across the economy, across developed economies. The UK is which this does reflect occupational factors. It reflects caring. It reflects reflects in particular kind of the different jobs that people do within the UK, and the extent to which women have reduced hours as well as have left work. And our work with Gingerbread has shown in particular how single parents have lost out, with single parents being significantly more likely to be away from work in the second quarter of 2020, so during the first lockdown, as couple parents, nearly a third away from work, compared to about 1 in 5 for couple parents and about between 1 in 4 and 1 in 5 for those without dependent children. More broadly on disadvantaged groups, there are signs that, in particular, for disabled people, progress on narrowing employment gaps has stalled and may even be starting to reverse. That's a blue line there, with disabled people twice as likely to have been out of work as non-disabled people. And for some other groups, in particular for ethnic minority groups, there are really significant differences within groups, which I think can reflect occupational factors and will need, I think, much more kind of exploration and understanding what's been driving these differences. But work that we recently published for Youth Futures Foundation and Blagrave Trust pointed to, in particular, that Black young people had 4 times as great a fall in employment as young white people, and young Asian people had around 3 times as large a fall in employment during the crisis. This may well reflect, I think probably almost certainly does reflect occupational factors, both the jobs being lost and the jobs being created. But it feels like a blind spot for the government around around its policy response, which has so far been in sort of larger scale sort of broad-based measures to support recovery rather than more targeted support for particular disadvantaged groups. Just a word on place. I probably haven't really got time. I started this in just at the end this morning because I'm conscious that, in particular, that Christina and Steve Fothergill have done some great work looking at impacts on places, which I may well might like to come back to in the questions in the discussion. But it does appear that impacts have been broadly similar, around between a 2 and a 4 percentage point change across all places, pretty much in claimant count. But those areas that had higher claimant unemployment before the crisis have got higher unemployment now. There is a positive but a weak correlation between prior employment and employment growth. And some areas, particularly some London boroughs, have really stood out as having really significant impacts, which is driven in particular by reliance on private sector jobs and relatively insecure employment, which have both been hit really hard in the crisis. And last year we did a lot of work looking at vacancies, and employment, and we found in that it's clearly it's not just how many people are out of work; it's also about access to new jobs. That a combination of weak vacancies and high employment meant that the impacts were greater than they appeared to be when you just look at claimant unemployment in more disadvantaged areas, in particular ex-industrial areas, coastal towns, and some inner cities, where relatively high levels of unemployment combined with relatively low levels of job creation were creating far greater impacts on those places. Okay, talking about low incomes, a key part of low incomes is low pay, and a really significant dimension to this. If we have avoided an unemployment crisis, which I think we probably have, we're not facing 3, 4, 5 million unemployed. We are at risk of walking into an underemployment one and a crisis of low hours, over occupation, so people working in jobs that are a lower skill level than they're qualified for, underemployment and low pay. And actually the low paid were hit particularly hard in the crisis. This was a crisis of low paid employment really in the first lockdown, with being 3 times more likely to have lost their jobs, to have moved out of work during the crisis. At least twice as likely to have been temporarily away from work as well. And we've seen employment. This is a really hard graph, but it'll be you can have a dive into it when we send the slides around separately. Employment in the bottom panel here, employment is falling in relatively lower paid occupations, elementary jobs in particular, caring jobs, I say driven by childcare, and to some extent in relatively lower kind of paid skilled trade jobs as well. So this is kind of relatively low paid jobs seeing big falls in employment, and employment's been growing where it has been growing. It's been growing in places the sorts of occupations that are relatively higher paid, particularly public service jobs, some administrative jobs, and some associate professions. So this actually, this is kind of on one level, this is potentially a positive, isn't it? But it really risks growing polarization in the labour market, particularly given the fact that the government has invested really virtually nothing in terms of new money to support retraining and skills acquisition for people moving between jobs. And signs already that insecure work is rising, and the best proxy I think for insecure work in the labour force surveys around involuntary part-time or temporary work. So people doing that work, they can't find full-time or permanent work. And both of these are showing signs of rising now, as they did in the last crisis. And in the case of involuntary part-time work, it's rising from a higher base than it was in the last, in prior to the last crisis. So I think people wanting more hours and being underemployed is a really significant labour market risk, and it's one that we've not been able to address in our public policy responses in the past. I think I should probably just stop there. I mean, just a final point here is about incomes. I do worry. I've got one final point about benefit system, but penultimate point about incomes. I do worry that we're as Ruth has talked, has set out really well. We need, we're not recognising our public policy response the significant impact on low-income households in particular. Average incomes overall are going to fall in 2020 and 2021, and they're going to rise to below long-term trend rates of household income growth after that. And of course, these are averages, and underneath these averages, we know that the bottom fifth of households have seen really significant falls in their incomes. The final point on the safety net, the point's been made about universal credit. I think this is only part of the challenge. We need to, fixing the gaps in our safety net needs to include significant reform statutory sick pay, increasing it and extending it. I think we really must suspend benefit cap. Sorry, this is there's rogue pound signs in there. So 170,000 people are now subject to the cap, which in effect is just clawing back the £20 uplift in universal credit. And I think the benefit cap numbers are about to soar as the transitional protections that existed, the grace period that existed for people who entered it earlier, starts to run out. And we do urgently need to reform and improve support for low-income renters in particular, many of whom have been caught out as they've left work and are unable to move to do anything about their, to reduce their housing costs. So that's a bit of a run through. Sorry, there's a lot of data there. Over to you. Thank you.
That's great, Tony. And I think it works really well to see that overview of the labour market as a whole and the particular sectors that have been hit so hard. And I can see clapping hands in the background again, which is always nice to see. To see that overview relative to the lived experience and the individual impact on people. Without further ado, we're quite tight for time. So I'm going to hand over to Peter Wells, who's has had the enviable task of going through all your questions in the chat function. I'll say in advance, I'm sorry if we don't get questions, but we will try our best.
Okay, I've got about 12 questions. So 12 questions, 12 minutes. First question, and I'm going to group some of them together. So as you'll, let's get on with it anyway. Question for Ruth, and two parts to this from Victoria and then something from Joanne. One was around sort of the gendered nature, the gendered structure of your research. How many men, how many women were interviewed? How was gender explored? Gendered roles within the house and the home around care. And then from Joanna, a question around, did you find, the rising in experience of domestic violence as well? Was that reflected in your research?
Yeah, thanks. Thank you, Peter. So in terms of our sample, I should have probably set this out at the beginning. It's like predominantly, really predominantly female samples. So I think it's about just over 90% female. So we haven't done like a proper kind of analysis or comparison of the qualitative data by gender, but we are primarily having the experiences of mothers. And I think, as I think Victoria's question was kind of flagging, the kind of the emotional labor of juggling those roles. But of some of the fathers, we have quite a few single fathers in the study, and they do talk quite a lot. And one of the things that comes through strongly in that is the sense of wanting to be a strong, it comes through from the mothers as well, but wanting to be there and to kind of to provide the security, and that having a negative impact on their mental health because they feel that they can't provide that because of the financial hardship. So trying to protect their children from the kind of impact poverty they're experiencing. In terms of the domestic violence, so we've got quite a few of the parents that we're working with who have had historic experience of domestic violence. We don't have anybody at the moment who's talking about experiencing it in their current relationship. And what's come out from that, and I think again there's kind of wider literature about this, is how obviously the conditions of the pandemic kind of sometimes replicate their experiences of being within an abusive relationship, and so that can be very hard in terms of the experiences of control and of being kind of told, you must do this, you mustn't do this. But also, and it links to a fantastic PhD that I examined, like based in Sheffield, just I don't know, 10 days ago, but also sometimes how the interactions with officials can actually be experienced as kind of replicating that as well. So again, we talked about, and Tony mentioned, conditionality, where the experience of being told you must do this being experienced as a kind of exercise of power and control over people's lives. And that's something that Beth Speak talks about in her work as well.
Thanks, Ruth. Really clear answers there. Just a couple of questions for Tony, if we may, from David and Dave Webster and Becky Tunstall. One was around, have we got the right measures for unemployment now? You've seen sort of quirks in our kind of use of the employment and the ILO measures of unemployment, which actually are hiding certain things, you feel. So that's one question. And then the second from Becky Tunstall was around, so we're seeing sort of reduction in hours as a response, coerced or voluntary response. How does that compare to the last recession?
Yeah, so on the measurement point, I think either LFS unemployment is going to rise towards the claimant count, or the claimant count is going to fall towards LFS. And I just assumed really until a few months ago we were going to see LFS unemployment rising towards claimant count. I just don't know now. I mean, we'd expect to be seeing that coming through, starting to see that coming through a bit more. There's some problems with the LFS, which I won't dive into here, but there are some problems which mean it could be being unemployment might actually be overstated in the LFS, quite possibly, but it certainly is. It doesn't appear to be right. I do worry there might be quite a lot of people on the claimant count who aren't actually unemployed, who may have some work, but because the department aren't actively managing the claims, are being kept as open claims in effect. And I don't know, others may have seen too, but there's been various news stories about people saying I'm unemployed and I can't get off universal credit. I'm employed, I've got a job and I can't close my claim, or I'm, etc. There are some practical things. So the department has basically stopped closing claims, and that's what I'm slightly worried about, is that because it's administratively takes time, it's time consuming to do that. So it's going to take a while before we know, to be honest. It's not as simple as in the US. And universal credit is a mess for measuring unemployment. It's hopeless at measuring unemployment, measuring conditionality, measuring labour market status generally. So it's not straightforward as in the US, where if you claim unemployment benefits, you're out of work and actively looking for work. On job insecurity, yeah, absolutely. On hours adjustment, it's been far greater in this crisis because of the job retention scheme. It's encouraged and incentivized hours reduction rather than job loss, and that's all things being equal, that's a good thing. I think what's interesting is the 6.5 is a slide that's in my pack that I didn't talk about. The 6.5% forecast is assuming that as soon as JRS is removed, it'll rebound, and then actually there'll be a big adjustment in unemployment rather than hours. I just don't think that's going to happen personally. I think there's various other reasons why the JRS may end with a whimper rather than a bang. But I would suspect that we'll continue to see adjustment in hours. And for that reason, if we stay on the path out of lockdown, actually unemployment might peak closer to 6%. I just don't see that people who are working short hours will become unemployed rather than, for example, stay on those hours or find other jobs. But it does really depend on what's happening in the wider labour market. And the point about employment support, there's a question about employment support, Pete, if I can just take that briefly, about what sorts of things have worked from Katie. We have seen some good examples in employment programmes. Most employment programmes have switched off conditionality, including the contracted out ones during the crisis, and focused much more on just support and particularly helping people, for example, with health conditions to pick up their prescriptions, to stay in social contact, to be better, to get the support they need. Ruth may pick up some of this COVID Realities project as well. So there have been some positives, which I'd hope might shift the dial a bit, but I don't know if in terms of how we design those programs too. But I don't know if that is going to happen in Restart to any significant extent. But we have also seen some employment growth. My concern is it's predominantly in relatively insecure work, And I do think in, question, are we going to see a growth in precarious and less secure work post-crisis? I do fear that we are. And I think the fact that the government had committed to an employment bill, which it now doesn't seem to have any intention of taking forward, which is going to address issues around one-sided flexibility, is really concerning. There are things that the government has on its list and it's been told it should be doing by the Low Pay Commission, among others, which now don't appear to be being legislated for. But I mean, I would say, this is going to be, there is this potential that we might see quite a strong recovery later in the year, and I don't know, but it's potentially we might, and that might mean there's a bit more bargaining power for workers. It doesn't feel likely though. I mean, I'm much more worried about job security right now than about unemployment, I think.
Tony, thank you. Tony, you're always brilliant at answering about half a dozen questions at once, which is brilliant. I have a couple of questions going back to Ruth, which have been posed, one by Thomas and I think another one by Becky, and they're kind of dealing with agency and relationships and rights. And the first one is around kind of rights of the child, childhood experiences through the research, and how they have been stressed, how they've developed. And the second question was around housing conditions, and particularly kind of agency around relationship with landlords, whether you had picked up anything in changing patterns of behaviour around relations with landlords in terms of flexibility.
Yeah, thank you. I should try Tony's trick of just answering a load of other questions, but yeah. So I think on the point of the kind of the child, so we are very sort of clearly focusing on the experiences of families through the lens of the parent, and so, but a lot of what parents are telling us is around how this is like impacting on their children, and obviously and I think probably one of the things that's been most, I don't know, stark and also difficult, and also against the context of all the discussion about children and the kind of mental health crisis that children are experiencing, is the extent to which parents do report like the negative mental health impacts on their child particularly. And we saw that, and I think just the very clear relationship, which again, people like Kitty's work shows that actually if you don't provide cash transfers, they have negative outcomes for, and these are outcomes that are felt negatively by children. So at the time of homeschooling, we had quite a lot of parents talking about not being able to afford to kind of keep their children entertained, to enable the children to access the kind of digital provision, and that directly contributing to increased difficulties in their children's behaviour and indeed mental health. On the housing question, so that's a really good question that we haven't kind of focused in on so much. So one of the things that, because of time, I couldn't go into in detail, is the extent to which each week we kind of pose a big question of the week, which is thematic, and it's a chance to kind of ask all our parents about any aspect of their experience, or also about something that's timely that's happening, maybe because of coronavirus or because of policy response. And housing is actually on our list to ask. So I think I'm kind of really focusing particularly on housing is gonna come up very soon. But I think generally people talk about place, so about issues with maybe place and around their kind of local environment. That's come through quite strongly, but not particular issues around housing so far. Just because I might just try Tony's trick just to answer, just to follow up. Katie, I know you're going to learn. You've got to learn as you go. So just to, on Katie's point about employment support. So not again, we're going to look at this. We've still got a few months. We're going to look at kind of experiences of employment support and conditionality in more detail. But I think what we really find, and it's interesting in terms of what Tony was saying, is that people still experience a lot of their encounters in terms of the kind of broader infrastructure as quite negative encounters, because they're still framed by conditionality. So even though conditionality is perhaps not, like the threat is maybe not real, people often don't, that hasn't been communicated effectively enough, and people are still, in many cases with the parents we're working with, they've got a long history and a memory of those kind of conditional encounters, and so those then frame those relationships in, I think, problematic ways, and it undermines the potential for people to see those encounters in more positive ways.
Thanks both. I'm really conscious of the time, and probably going to lose quite a few colleagues in a moment, so I think as I say, I think Ruth very helpfully put her email address in the chat. There are a lot of questions which we'll record. I'm going to hand back to Tina now, I think, whether just to kind of wrap up, or any final things you want to raise, Tina, but I'll hand back to you.
Just to say thank you so much to both of you for speaking this morning and for pulling together such a wealth of information. We will put the slide packs on the CRESR website, and also there's details on the website of the next CRESR seminar, which I think is in April. I'm afraid I don't have the details right in front of me now, but please do keep up with them, because it's so good to see people engaging with real-time research as it comes out, so that we can all understand what's going on across the impact of COVID, issues in and around the labour markets, and issues in and around low-income families. So thanks all for coming. I hope you found it useful, and hopefully we'll see you again at another CRESR seminar at another point. Okay, bye.